Hey everyone, I'm Tyler. And this is my younger brother, Alex.
And together, we're the Water Brothers. We're gonna take you on an adventure around the world to explore the state of our blue planet, a planet defined by water and its ability to sustain life.
So join us on our journey as we explore the world, looking at the most important water stories of our time.
And together, we will learn how to better protect our most precious resource. Only 3% of the world's water is freshwater. And of that tiny amount of fresh water on Earth, 70% of it can be found here, frozen at the poles in massive ice sheets 3 kilometers thick. This is the world's water bank. But the bank is being emptied. The ice is melting. And as it melts, a habitat that many of the world's most resilient survivors depend on is disappearing. The Arctic has become the first casualty of our greenhouse gas emissions. But no matter where you live, we will all soon be victims of the Big Thaw. Tyler and I needed to travel to the Arctic, and our journey to the front lines of climate change began in Iceland, where we met up with the organization Students on Ice.
Students on Ice is a program that takes mostly high school students and university students to the Arctic and the Antarctic on educational expeditions, together with teams of scientists, experts, elders, musicians, artists. Climate change has become one of the central themes for all the expeditions because the polar regions are the front lines of climate change.
Students on Ice was the perfect group to share this journey with. Along the whole trip, we would be in a living classroom and would be able to see the effects of climate change for ourselves. With a name like Iceland, this was an ideal place to start our journey into the Arctic. Even though the country is actually quite green in summer, glaciers still dominate parts of the landscape, and their movements have shaped the country. Iceland is also one of the most geologically active places on Earth, and the island is covered in massive mountains, waterfalls, and fjords, carved out by centuries of glacial and volcanic activity. Iceland is also one of the few places in the world where people can view geysers in action. Geysers are formed when water comes in contact with rocks heated by magma, and the result is awesome. The word geyser actually comes from the Icelandic name of the geyser we visited, which in English roughly translates to gushing water. So right now we're all about to meet the President of Iceland, so we're pretty excited to hear what he has to say about Students on Ice and our trip.
So now the world has finally kind of woken up to the fact that perhaps the most important area for the 21st century will be the part of the world where you're going to travel. Climate change is taking place 3 times faster in the northern part of the world than anywhere else. The north, not just because of its beauty and its extraordinary landscape and nature, will be of huge global importance for the global economy, for the survival of people everywhere. Wherever you live in the world, your fate in the coming decades will depend on what happens in the part of the world you're going to travel to.
Before we set sail, we visited the Viking World Museum to see how they crossed the Atlantic over 1,000 years ago. Luckily for us, our boat is a little better equipped to handle the rough seas.
So we boarded the Clipper Adventurer, the ship that would be our home for our journey. Our first stop would be the remote West Fjords region of northern Iceland. But to get there, we first had to cross the Arctic Circle.
So we just crossed the Arctic Circle, and Tyler and I have never been this far north before. And this is definitely when our Arctic adventure really begins.
Is climate change really affecting Iceland yet?
Oh, yes, it is. We have 10% of Iceland, 11% maybe, covered by perennial ice, what we like to call it, glacier ice. 5 big ice caps, 200-300 mountain glaciers. And they, for the last, let's say, just to take that period, last 20-30 years, they have been receding, and faster with each year. So it's alarming, but we are of course also experiencing the rise of sea level, because that's an international phenomenon due to global warming all over the world.
People around the world should be concerned about the changes, because what's happening in the north is going to happen elsewhere. Because the north holds so much ice, and because that ice has the potential of melting and changing things like ocean currents and climate and raising sea levels, what's happening in the north is already worrying people in the south, in the tropics, because people who live at sea level are concerned that they're going to have to move.
So we're here in northwest Iceland to check out some of the bird colonies that you're going to find on these steep cliffs that are just off the shore. Seabirds are important because they can tell us a lot about how climate is shifting in the Arctic. In the summer months, hundreds of millions of migratory birds congregate in the Arctic to take advantage of an explosion in marine life. These abundant food supplies make it a perfect place for birds to breed and raise young. Over 1 million birds will make up a single colony like this one, and they have a huge impact on Arctic biodiversity.
Things are changing so rapidly right now with climate change, and some of the very first indicators of how climate change is affecting wildlife are being shown to us through what's happening to seabirds. They're very easy to look at. We know where they are. They're vocal, they're obvious on the landscape, and we can watch how their lives are changing. If their lives are changing, then the lives of the biodiversity that they share their habitats with are also changing.
Bird migrations to the Arctic must be perfectly timed with the movement of sea ice so they can access the rich food supplies in the waters underneath. But as sea ice disappears, birds are responding by shifting their breeding schedules.
They're arriving to the colonies a little bit earlier, they're laying eggs a little earlier, they're sort of going through their whole cycle earlier than normal. When that starts to happen, when timing starts to shift, a lot of species will rely on the timing of another species to provide their food or other aspects of their life cycle. So when those things start to become disconnected, we're worried that that might cause some problems.
This is because so many animals depend on the arrival of these seabirds. So when the timing of their migrations change, the effects are felt across the entire food web. When winter returns, these birds will once again migrate south, as far away as sub-Saharan Africa and South America. So even minor shifts in the timing of their migrations can have global implications. So we're just leaving Iceland right now. We're beginning our journey across the Atlantic, and our first stop is going to be Greenland.
The 2-day trip from Iceland to Greenland took us across the Denmark Strait, and it was the perfect place for us to learn alongside the students about the importance of the polar oceans in regulating global climate. The whole ocean is connected, and if something happens in one place, it affects another. But here in the North Atlantic, because it is so vital in driving global ocean circulation, it is a particularly important place to watch.
Right now we're in the North Atlantic on our way from Iceland to Greenland, and this is a really important place in terms of global oceanography because it's a place where North Atlantic deep water forms. So you must get really excited when you get to this part of the world, right? I'm pretty stoked to be here. Yeah, this is awesome. The North Atlantic has a really critical role in terms of bringing oxygen down into the deep ocean and also for helping to bring nutrients back up to the surface ocean where there's sunlight and where things can grow. As climate change warms the polar regions, ice sheets, like the Greenland ice sheet, are melting quickly. And this is supplying a lot of fresh water into the oceans. That fresh water makes the surface of oceans, like the surface of the North Atlantic here, less dense. And when the density decreases, these waters have a hard time getting down into the deep ocean. As the formation of North Atlantic deep water slows down because of the freshening, it reduces the supply of oxygen to the deep ocean here and everywhere else in the world.
And this is why oceanographers like Dr. Galbraith are carefully studying changes in the formation of North Atlantic deep water. Not only does this sinking water help disperse oxygen to the ocean depths, but it also helps drive global ocean circulation and regulate climate. This is because the Atlantic is the only part of the ocean where heated water is transported north across the equator, along the Gulf Stream current. As the Gulf Stream travels north, it comes in contact with frigid Arctic winds that cool the water, making it denser and causing it to sink. But if Arctic air is not cold enough, or if melting ice makes the North Atlantic too fresh, this key link in global ocean circulation could suddenly stop working. No one knows exactly how much meltwater it will take to shut down the Gulf Stream. But as the force of this one vital current continues to slow, it will lead to spin-off effects on heat and oxygen transport across the entire ocean.
So right now we're about to participate in the Drift Bottle Project. And what that is we put these little messages inside these empty bottles. As they wash up on shore all around the world, people can find them, and then they can open up the bottles, find out about the Drift Bottle Project, and respond to us and tell us where they wash up. And what that tells us is how ocean currents work in the North Atlantic. And since these ocean currents have a big role in influencing climate in the region, it can really tell us how ocean currents are changing and how climate could change in the future. All right, here we go.
As sea ice retreats each spring, nutrient-rich waters are exposed to sunlight, fueling plankton blooms that can get so big they can be seen from space. Seen here stretching along the eastern coast of Greenland. Plankton is at the base of the ocean food chain, so massive blooms like this will attract animals from around the world. On only our second day at sea, we encountered the biggest surprise of the entire trip, a pair of blue whales heading north to get in on the feast. And you would think that being the biggest animals that have ever lived, they would be easy to track. But even whale experts like Richard Sears will admit, there is still a lot to learn about these mysterious giants.
My name got associated with blue whales because I was really the first person to work on them anywhere, and I've been doing that for over 30 years. We know a lot more, certainly today, than we did even 5 years ago about these animals. And we're getting a better idea on the numbers of them, and it seems as though blue whales in the eastern North Atlantic are more abundant than we ever thought. We had no idea how many there really were, and just now we have over 300. Could there be 600? Could it be 2,000 of them here? Maybe even more? We don't know. It's just going to take more and more work, more and more effort in the field to be able to answer those questions.
Ice is disappearing across the Arctic, but the biggest losses are being seen in the extent and thickness of sea ice cover, especially during the summer months. Sea ice is the ice that forms when the upper layer of the ocean freezes, while icebergs are the chunks of glaciers that have fallen into the sea. In the summer of 2011, when we arrived in Greenland, sea ice cover was at its lowest recorded level since satellite tracking began in 1979. A Canadian research team recently estimated that the amount of sea ice cover lost that summer was the highest in over 1,450 years.
So Tyler and I are here on Greenland. And if there's one thing that defines this island, the largest island on Earth, it has to be ice. Ice covers 80% of the surface area. And if you add up all the ice on Greenland, it adds up to 2.85 million cubic kilometers. It's an impossible number to fathom, but if all the ice melted on Greenland, enough fresh water would enter the ocean to raise sea levels by over 7 meters, flooding coastal cities around the world.
It could take a long time for all the ice on Greenland to disappear, but the ice cap is already melting away faster than it is naturally being replenished. And because it is so large, this extra meltwater will have a big impact on raising sea levels.
What is the biggest threat to glaciers?
Definitely climate change. The warming of the atmosphere is melting the glaciers away, and it's significant.
Even in the last sort of 20 years, many of these glaciers have retreated from the sea back, many gone back 1 or 2 kilometers. So yes, there's been a dramatic change.
Glaciers provide fresh water for all of civilizations. The vast majority of people in the world rely on snow and ice melt that's emerging from the world's mountain systems and flowing down to the lower plain areas where people live. The area of melt, called the ablation zone, has doubled in size over the last 20 years. 16% more meltwater is being produced than it was 20 years ago. If we remove that ice off of the island of Greenland and transfer it into the oceans, that would flood out coastal cities. Florida would be underwater. Victoria would be underwater. It would just be catastrophic.
So we left the Greenland ice cap and headed west to visit a local Inuit community called Nanortalik. It was amazing to get a glimpse of life in the Arctic, and an honor to watch as the Canadian Inuit on our trip put on a performance for the locals. In exchange, the Greenlanders put on their own demonstration of traditional kayaking and boating techniques. Kayaks were actually invented by the Inuit, and it was these boats that allowed them to master these unforgiving waters and become the ultimate marine hunters in human history.
Over the years, you could see the changes, right? Freezing up a little bit later, going out a little bit earlier, like breaking up a little bit earlier, and then this year it drastically changed. Like normally we'd start freezing up in November, right? Our ice started freezing up in January. If you've been on the land half your life or all your life on the ice, you can see the different condition. Like you know when not to go to certain areas of ice, you know when not to go to certain areas of snow, just by looking at it, because you understand it, it's part of you, right? But the last few years, there's been hunters that have lived off the land, go through the ice because they didn't realize the ice was thinner or something like it's very different. You gotta be a bit more careful than you used to be.
And it's not just humans that must adapt. When sea ice disappears, it has a huge impact on Arctic biodiversity, simply because so many animals depend on the movement and extent of sea ice to access food and to time their migrations. Of all the incredible animals of the Arctic, polar bears have become the symbols of Arctic climate change because they need sea ice in order to hunt seals, their main prey source. As sea ice continues to decline, they will have to work even harder to access food. A full-grown female bear needs to kill at least 1 seal a week in order to have sufficient energy to feed herself and raise cubs. So if food becomes scarce, it has a big impact on reproduction. For now, polar bears are surviving despite the current losses. But in a world without any summer sea ice, there is little that can be done to save the polar bear in the wild.
Polar bears depend on sea ice for most of their annual cycle. If that sea ice isn't there, it deprives them of a major hunting area, a major hunting platform. I mean, bears travel on the ice, they hunt from the ice, it allows them to get seals. Used to having a summer free of ice where they don't feed that much. They hold up on islands or on coastlines or go wandering inland across valleys and so forth. But if that summer period becomes too long, if they can't spend time on the ice in the spring after winter, then they're in poor shape, they're not going to breed, they're going to have to find a new area to occupy.
Climate change will continue, and there's no doubt about that. Most people are looking at climate change with, ooh, what's going on here? But there are many looking at it with very bright eyes, because suddenly the legendary Northwest Passage, the Northeast Passage across the top of Russia, they're suddenly going to be navigable by ships. For a country like Russia, the economic value is colossal. Suddenly you have contact over this vast country over a waterway they never had.
The most ironic twist of the Big Thaw is that it will actually encourage oil exploration and the growth of industries that have contributed so much to global carbon emissions. All the more reason for governments of the North to carefully monitor development and trade that takes place in this new Arctic landscape.
Minerals are being discovered as the ice caps retreat. Greenland is a classic example. Rare minerals like molybdenum and chromiums are now appearing, if you like, from under the ice. So there are all sorts of things that the Arctic could be used for. And again, obviously that's a concern because it may be overexploited. But one hopes now that lessons have been learned from previous exploitation, and maybe we can actually use these resources in a sensible way.
From Greenland, we crossed the Davis Strait and arrived in Labrador, where we would take our flight home. But before leaving, we needed one last Arctic experience. The ice may be melting, but for now, the Arctic is still very cold. Trust us. Bye, everybody!
We had barely scratched the surface of the immense size and beauty of the Arctic, and the challenges that Canadians and all of us face to better protect it.
Canada is a polar nation. We control 30% of the Arctic. It's our largest coastline, the Arctic Ocean. Our country is larger north-south than it is east to west. And a huge part of our future, our domestic and foreign policy, is going to be focused on the Arctic.
Well, I think the signs of hope are in the youth. The kids that are on this trip on Students on Ice, in a group of 70-odd kids, you're going to find that this experience of being in the North is life-changing. For some of them, they're going to become activists, they're going to become biologists or oceanographers or who knows what. But all of them are going to be aware.
So ice really matters to Iceland?
It matters to the whole world because the big twos, Antarctica and the Greenland ice cap, they control partly the climate. They control partly the ocean currents. And so they are equally important to us as the rainforests are. So this is a global issue for us to think about the rainforest in Ecuador and for the Ecuadorians to think about the ice sheets in Iceland.
So Al, is it still too late to save the Arctic?
Well, I hope not. And in our short time here, it definitely became clear that climate change is real and that water and ice are at the center of this climate change story. The evidence was everywhere we looked.
And climate change is not some event on the horizon. It's happening right now. And we're running out of precious time to stop this process.
But if there are any reasons to be hopeful, it's that we can all play a part in protecting the ice that is left here. It's really not too late.
And there's not one person or one country we can turn to for some magical solution. We need to hold ourselves accountable first, and then our countries and governments, before we blame other people for the Big Thaw. We are at an amazing time in human history where we can easily initiate change in our daily lives on a local level to solve a global problem.
And then here in Canada, we need to become global leaders in climate change action, because it's our people, our wildlife, and our Arctic that are suffering the most from the Big Thaw.